made my daughter-in-law pot roast the Sunday she moved in. She stood in my kitchen doorway, looked at the Dutch oven on the stove, and said, "Oh, you still cook like that?" She didn't wait for an answer. She just turned around and went back to the living room where my son was carrying in boxes. I stood there holding a wooden spoon I'd had since 1987, and I smiled. That's what I do. I smile. My name is Evelyn. I'm 69 years old. I've lived in this house in Clarksburg, West Virginia for 31 years. My late husband Gerald built the back porch with his own hands. My roses are still in the side yard, the ones I planted the spring after my youngest was born. This house is mine. The deed says so. The mortgage was paid off in 2019, and I stood in the kitchen and cried when I made that last payment because Gerald didn't live to see it. My son, I'll call him my son because that's what he is, for better or worse, moved back home in March with his wife. They'd been married 2 years. The story was that they needed to save money. His lease was up, her job had changed, they just needed 6 months to get back on their feet. 6 months. I wrote that down in my journal the night he asked me. I underlined it twice. I said yes because he's my child. What else do you say? She came in like she was doing me a favor. The first week, I didn't say anything when she rearranged the living room. She moved Gerald's armchair, the brown leather one he watched every single Super Bowl in from 1998 onward, to the corner behind the door where nobody sits. She put a little accent table there instead, with a fake succulent on it. I moved the chair back after she went to bed. She moved it again the next morning. I let it stay that time. I told myself it was just furniture. Gerald isn't in that chair anymore. He's in the backyard in the roses, in the way the afternoon light hits the kitchen window around 4 o'clock. He doesn't need the chair, but I noticed. I notice everything. The second week she started commenting on my cooking, not to my face, not directly. She had a particular way of doing it. She'd take one bite, set her fork down very deliberately, and say something like, "This is so old-fashioned. I love it. Very retro." She said that about my chicken and dumplings, my mother's recipe, my grandmother's before that. The third week, she invited 2 of her friends over for dinner on a Tuesday without asking me. I cooked anyway. I made a full meal. Pot roast again, because it's what I know, because it fed my children through every hard year we ever had. I set the table properly, put out the good napkins, even found a candle. She came downstairs, looked at the table, and laughed. Not at me, just... She laughed and said something to her friend, and the friend laughed too. They thought I was in the other room. I was right there, in the hallway. I heard every word. She said, "She does this every time. Full spread. Candles. Like it's Thanksgiving." I keep telling Troy, "That's my son. I won't use his name." But she said his name, that we need to just get our own place before I lose my mind. Her friend said, "How long are you staying?" She said, "Until we can afford the down payment." But honestly, at this point, I'd rather rent forever. I went back to the kitchen. I finished plating the food. I brought it out. I smiled. They ate every bit of it. That night, I sat at Gerald's desk in the bedroom and I thought for a long time. I thought about the 6 months. We were 3 weeks in. I thought about the down payment she mentioned. Where exactly was that money coming from, and what was the plan? I thought about a lot of things. I opened the drawer of the nightstand on my side of the bed. Gerald's side had been empty for 6 years, but mine still had everything I kept there. And I took out the folder where I keep the house documents. Deed, insurance, property tax records. I just wanted to look at them. I do that sometimes when I feel like something is shifting under my feet. I look at the paper with my name on it and I remember that this is mine. I earned it. The deed was there. But something else had been moved. I keep a small envelope in that folder. Inside it is a photograph of my mother, a folded letter my husband wrote me on our 20th anniversary, and a USB drive with scanned copies of every important document we own: birth certificates, social security cards, the original mortgage paperwork. I know exactly how I keep that envelope. The photograph is always on top, facing up. The photograph was face down. I sat very still for a minute. Then I opened my laptop and I checked my email, because a few weeks earlier I'd gotten a notification from my bank, one of those alerts that says your account was accessed from a new device. I'd thought it was a glitch. I hadn't looked into it. I looked into it now. There had been 2 logins from a device I didn't recognize, both in the past 3 weeks. Once to check my balance, wants to check the routing number on my savings account. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark for a while. The next morning, I acted like nothing had happened. I made breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast, the good orange juice. I set it on the table and called down the hall that it was ready. My son came in first, poured himself coffee, kissed me on the cheek. She came in a few minutes later in her robe, looked at the eggs, and said, "I'm actually doing low carb right now, so." She took a piece of toast, pulled out her phone, and sat down without looking at me. I smiled. I poured myself coffee. I sat across from her and I watched her scroll through her phone, and I thought, I know what you've been doing. I didn't say anything. Not yet. That week, I started paying attention in a different way. Not suspicious, deliberate. There's a difference. Suspicious is reactive. Deliberate is a plan. I noticed she spent a lot of time on her laptop at the kitchen table when my son was at work. I noticed she'd taken to keeping the door to their bedroom locked, even when she was inside. I noticed that twice she'd gone to the mailbox before I could get to it, and when I asked her once if anything had come for me, she said, "Just ads. I put them in recycling," but I'd already checked the recycling and there was nothing there. One Thursday, I came home from my weekly coffee with my friend Adeline. We've met at the same diner on Route 50 every Thursday for 11 years, and I came through the back door instead of the front because my hands were full of groceries. She didn't hear me come in. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and she was on the phone, and I heard her say, "This estimate says 185, but the realtor thinks if they do an appraisal, it could come in closer to 200. Yeah? No, she doesn't know. She barely uses her computer. She heard me set the bags down and she ended the call immediately. "Oh, I didn't hear you come in," she said. "I use the back door when I have groceries," I said. "I always have." She smiled. I smiled. We were very polite. I put the groceries away slowly. I made sure my hands didn't shake. $200,000, that's what my house was worth. My house, that I had paid off, that had my name on the deed, that Gerald's hands had touched in 100 different places. She was on the phone talking about my house like it was an investment she was researching. I finished putting the groceries away. I went upstairs. I called my attorney. His name is Mr. Aldridge. He handled Gerald's estate. I've known him for 15 years. He's patient and he's thorough and he never talks to me like I'm old. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Evelyn, I want you to come in this week. Bring the deed, the insurance paperwork, and your bank statements for the last 60 days. I said, "Is there something I should be worried about?" He said, "I want to make sure everything is properly protected. As a homeowner in West Virginia, you have options we should put in place." I had an appointment for Friday morning. I didn't sleep much that week, but I wasn't scared. I want to be clear about that. I've been scared before. The night Gerald had his first heart attack, the year my daughter went through her divorce, and I thought she might not come back from it, the morning I found the lump that turned out to be nothing. That's scared. This was something different. This was a kind of cold clarity, like when the power goes out in winter and everything goes quiet and sharp all at once. Friday morning, I drove myself to Mr. Aldridge's office. I wore the blue blouse Gerald always said made my eyes look lighter. I brought the folder. I brought the bank statements I'd printed at the library because I didn't trust the printer in the house anymore. We talked for 2 hours. He explained a few things to me that I hadn't known. He told me that in West Virginia, a spouse cannot force the sale of a property that belongs solely to one partner, that my son's name was nowhere on this deed, which meant he had no legal claim and neither did she. He told me about something called a homestead exemption that gave me additional protection. He helped me set up a separate bank account at a different institution that I would access only from my phone, which I had changed the passcode on that same morning. And then he said something that made me set down my pen. He said, "Evelyn, have you checked whether any of your personal property, jewelry, collectibles, anything of significant value is still where it belongs?" I thought about Gerald's watch. It wasn't a flashy thing, a Hamilton pocket watch, railroad grade, that had belonged to his father. We kept it in the cedar box in the hall closet on the top shelf with his father's military medals and a small blue velvet bag of cufflinks that had belonged to Gerald's grandfather. Gerald wore that watch on our wedding day. I had held it the night he died. I drove home and I went straight to the hall closet. The cedar box was there. It was in the right place Everything looked exactly as it should. I opened it. The watch was gone. The medals were still there. The cufflinks were still there. The little folded program from Gerald's father's funeral was still there. But the watch that his father had carried on the railroad through Kentucky and Tennessee and West Virginia, the watch that Gerald had pressed into my hands the morning of our wedding and said, "My father wanted you to have this too," that watch was not in the box. I stood in the hallway for a long time. Then I closed the closet door. I went to the kitchen. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat down at the table where she had been sitting when she was on the phone about my house. I drank the tea slowly. I thought about what Mr. Aldrich had said, which was, if anything is missing, do not confront anyone. Call me first. I called him. He said, "Do you know the name of any pawn shops nearby?" "There are 2 in Clarksburg." He said to make a list and to let him handle it from there. I want to tell you something about those next several days, because I think this is the part people don't understand when they hear stories like this. People expect you to be falling apart. They expect the crying, the confrontation, the scene in the kitchen where somebody slams a door. That's the version of this story that people think they know. But I've lived 69 years. I watched my husband die slowly over 14 months. I've buried my mother and my father and my best friend from high school. I've learned that the moments that matter most are not the loud ones. They're the quiet ones, where you decide who you are. I went to church on Sunday. I helped my neighbor Gail with her garden on Monday because her hip had been bothering her. I made dinner every night that week. I was pleasant. I asked my daughter-in-law how her work was going. I told my son he looked tired and he should get more sleep. I was, in every visible way, a 69-year-old woman going about her ordinary life. Inside, I was building something. Mr. Aldrich called me on Wednesday. He had located the watch. One of the pawn shops on the east side of town had received it 11 days earlier. He had spoken with the owner. With the receipt, the registration, and the documentation that the item was family property, taken without the owner's consent, it could be recovered. There was a process. It would take a few days. I asked him how much it had been pawned for. He told me. I sat with that number for a long time. $60. Gerald's father's watch, the one he carried from station to station across 3 states, the one Gerald wore on our wedding day. $60. Mr. Aldrich also told me that he had spoken with a colleague who specialized in elder law and that there were certain actions available to me as a sole property owner in a situation where a non-owner resident had demonstrated intent to investigate, transfer, or monetize protected assets. He said those were legal words. In plain English, what it meant was, I could ask them to leave, formally, with documentation, with a timeline that protected me and obligated them. He drafted the notice that Thursday. That Friday evening I made dinner as usual. Chicken pot pie from scratch, the crust that takes 45 minutes to make right. I set the table. I lit a candle, not the good candle, just the everyday one from the windowsill. My daughter-in-law came downstairs in a good mood, which sometimes happened on Fridays. My son poured drinks. We sat down. I passed the pie. I asked about their week. She said it was fine. She said she'd been thinking they might look at apartments soon, that the timing might be right. I said, I think that's a wonderful idea. She smiled. My son looked relieved. I said, actually, I've been thinking along the same lines. My attorney sent something over this afternoon. It's just paperwork, housekeeping things, but it does include a formal notice about the occupancy arrangement, the timeline, and a few protective clauses about the property. I paused. I took a bite of the pot pie. He suggests 60 days, which I think is more than fair. The table went very quiet. My son said, Mom. She said nothing. She had gone very still. That particular stillness of someone doing rapid calculations. I said, I also spoke with the pawn shop on Garfield Street. Gerald's watch will be returned to me by Tuesday. Mr. Aldrich handled the documentation. I looked at her then. I looked at her directly, for the first time in months. The way I should have looked at her in the kitchen doorway the night she said, You still cook like that. I said, I'll be keeping it in a different place from now on. She pushed her chair back. She said she wasn't hungry. She went upstairs. My son sat at the table for a long time. He didn't eat either. He looked at me in a way he hadn't looked at me since he was small, since the years when he was figuring out that I knew things he hadn't told me, that mothers always know. He said, "Mom, I didn't," and then he stopped. I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I don't know everything, I said, "I know that too." He said, "I'm sorry." I told him I loved him. I told him I would always love him. I told him that the 60 days was enough time to find something good, and that I would help him look if he wanted, and that when this was over and they had their own place, I would bring them a pot roast. He laughed at that, a small, broken laugh. He helped me clear the table. She came downstairs again around 9 o'clock. I was in the living room reading, Gerald's chair back in its correct place by the window where the evening light is good. She stood in the doorway for a moment. I think she was deciding what to say. I think she had a version ready, the anger version, the justification version, maybe even an apology. What she said was, "How long have you known?" I looked up from my book. I said, "Long enough." She nodded. She went back upstairs. They were out in 53 days. I counted. The watch is on my dresser now, in a small glass case I found at an antique shop in Bridgeport. Gerald's father's watch, railroad grade Hamilton, 1942. When the light comes through the bedroom window in the morning, it catches the case just right. I still make pot roast on Sundays. I still set the table properly with the good napkins even for myself, especially for myself. There's a version of this story where I'm the sad old woman who got taken advantage of. I understand why people want to tell it that way. It's tidier, but that's not what this is. This is the story of a woman who has been paying attention her entire life, who knows the difference between kindness and weakness, who built something real in this world and knows exactly what it's worth. My name is Evelyn. I'm 69 years old. I live alone in my house in Clarksburg, and every morning when I come downstairs and stand in my own kitchen, I think, this is mine, I earned it, and I am still here. I smile. I've been thinking about what I would say at the end of this story, and I keep coming back to the watch. Not to the pawn shop, not to the $60, though I think about that too, more than I'd like to admit. I keep coming back to the moment I opened that cedar box and understood what had happened. There was no dramatic music. No one was watching. It was just me, standing in my own hallway holding an empty space where something irreplaceable used to be. And here's what I've learned, truly learned. After 69 years of living, the people who take from you are counting on you to be too polite to notice, or too tired, or too afraid of conflict to say anything even if you do notice. They read your kindness as permission. They see your patience and they think it's weakness. They watch you smile and they assume the smile means you don't understand what's happening. I understood everything. There's a cause to every effect, and the cause here wasn't cruelty. It was assumption. My daughter-in-law assumed I was soft because I was quiet. She assumed I was unaware because I was accommodating. She assumed that a woman who makes pot roast on Sundays and sets the table with good napkins for no particular reason is a woman who can be outmaneuvered. That assumption is what undid her, not me. Her own underestimation of what I had built and what I was willing to protect. I think about my son too. He knew less than she did, but he knew something, and he let it go further than it should have. That part still sits with me some mornings, but I also know that the people we love most are capable of disappointing us without meaning to, and that forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. I love my son. I will always love my son. That doesn't mean I will ever again let anyone live in this house under terms that aren't entirely clear from the very first day. That's what I would tell anyone who finds themselves in a version of this situation, not the legal steps. Mr. Aldridge can explain those better than I can. But the other thing, the harder thing, trust your own perception. If something feels wrong, it probably is. If you keep making excuses for someone's behavior because confronting it feels uncomfortable, understand that the discomfort you're avoiding now will cost you far more later. Pay the smaller price, have the harder conversation, and do it before $60 and a moving truck become the only language anyone understands. There's a kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't flip a table or demand an audience. It just quietly makes an appointment with an attorney on a Friday morning, puts on the blue blouse, and brings the folder with all the documentation. That's the kind of courage I had to learn. Gerald used to say that the strongest thing a person could do was stay calm when everything in them wanted to panic. He was right. He was right about a lot of things. The watch is on my dresser now. Some mornings I look at it before I do anything else. It reminds me that the things worth protecting are often quiet things, a piece of someone you loved, a house you paid off with 30 years of your own life, a version of yourself that knows exactly where she stands. I'm still here, I'm still standing, and I still make pot roast on Sundays.